to part 2 of the Bible and the transgender experience. If you missed part 1, don't despair. You can always log into our website at www.cityoflightatlanta.com. Let's say that together, okay? www.cityoflightatlanta.com. Don't forget the Atlanta part, okay? Click on the sermon library and scroll down to April 19th. That was the date when part 1 was preached, April 19th. Now, how many of you were here on April 19th when I preached part 1? Raise your hand. Okay, good. Because I need you all to help me do a little review for those persons who weren't here of probably the two most important points from part 1. Are you ready? Okay, this is your question. Do the words transgender, transsexual, cross-dresser, intersexed, androgen, gender nonconforming, or genderqueer ever appear in the Bible? No, that is correct. They do not. So, when we go looking for what the scripture has to say about the gender nonconforming experience, it's very important to know what we're looking for. I'd like to illustrate with an example. What you see in this picture, okay, down, take it down, take it down, thank you, okay. All right, first of all, how many of you have ever seen that picture before someplace? All right, those of you who just raised your hand, I'd like you not to respond to these next couple of questions for just a moment. You'll get your turn in a minute, all right? Okay, for those of you who had never seen that picture before until just now, what did you see? Raise a hand, I'll take a hand. Okay, Norma, what did you see? You saw a cup. What color was it? Okay, you saw like a gold, was it like a coffee mug? What was it like? More like like a gold chalice, all right? Like we use for communion. You saw a gold chalice, all right? Good. What did anybody else see? Danielle, what did you see? Okay, were they young or old? Okay, so you saw two old persons, a man and a woman, looking at each other. Oh, okay. Okay, all right. Okay, you saw the same, but older. Okay, were they looking at each other? Okay, two persons who looked the same, only one was a man, kind of the same, except one was a man, one was a woman, and they were looking at each other. Okay, anybody see anything else? What did you see? You've never seen this before. Okay, well then, Chris, then you have seen it before, and you are not eligible to answer this question. Your turn's coming. Just hold on a minute. We'll get to you. Okay, anybody who had never seen that until just this morning when it was put on the screen, see something else. Lethe, what did you see? You saw two smiling elderly people. Right, okay. Anyone see anything else? What did you see, Barry? You saw somebody playing a guitar. Where were they? Inside the face of the other person. Did all of you see that? Okay, not everybody saw that. Anybody see anything else? You've seen this before. I'm not going to call on you. Okay, there are actually 5 people in that picture. How many of you who had never seen that picture before saw all 5? Let's put the picture back up and take a closer look. Somebody's saying the person, okay? The person, you see the person playing the guitar now, who's in the man's face, the elderly man's face? And now you see the other person sitting, kind of holding, who makes up the face of the woman? All right? And if you look to the elderly man's ear, that's actually a person sort of reclining in an archway. Okay? And do you all see that gold chalice that Norma saw? Okay. How many of you saw all of those things first glance, the first time you ever saw that picture? I didn't either. And the reason that I wanted us to look at this is because it's a great illustration of the reality that sometimes it's hard to see things unless someone suggests that they are there to be seen. And that is what we discovered during part 1 of this sermon when we started looking for gender nonconforming individuals in the Bible. In part 1, we learned that while we don't find our 21st century words for those who identify under the transgender umbrella in our ancient sacred texts, we did find a whole category of gender nonconforming people, and they were the eunuchs. We also learned that Jesus knew a gender nonconforming individual, the man who routinely did the woman's work of carrying water. Now this morning we're going to look at the lives of a few other familiar biblical characters and see if by looking just a little closer we might see some things about them that we hadn't seen before. So let's begin by looking at the patriarch Jacob. You know, the Jacob of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob fame. The one who wrestled with God and was given the name Israel, the father of the 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. If you will open in your bulletins to the centerfold, you'll see the page titled Scripture Relating to Gender Nonconformity. And there at the top you're going to find some verses about Jacob taken from Genesis chapter 25, verses 27 through 29. This is a passage about Jacob and his twin brother Esau. Y'all there? Okay. Please follow along with me. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, their father, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah, their mother, loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. Now, I have read the story of Jacob many times before. I've even preached on it in the past. But 2 years ago, while attending the MCC conference in Chicago, I got a fresh take on this passage. I saw it through new eyes. And this new perspective came from a one-man play called Transfigurations that was performed by actor, playwright, and biblical scholar Peterson Toscano. In his performance, Peterson told the story of Jacob from his twin brother Esau's perspective. And manly, hairy Esau's perspective, his take on his brother was that Jacob was a sissy, a mama's boy, always hanging out among the tents with the women and doing girly stuff like cooking and making stew. Wow. When I heard it put like that, I was like, duh, how come I never noticed that before? Now, does this mean that Jacob was effeminate or gay or transgender? We don't know for sure because along with not using our 21st century words that cover the identities in the transgender umbrella, the Bible as it was originally written also didn't use the historically modern words like gay or homosexual or lesbian. In fact, and this is just a little aside, the first translation of the Bible to use the term homosexual was the Revised Standard Version, and that was published in different sections from the late 1940s to the 1960s. Prior to that publication of that translation, The word homosexual was never found in any Bible. But back to the patriarch Jacob. While we cannot conclusively determine his gender identity or sexual orientation from the biblical accounts, I think it is accurate to say, given his preference for women's work and for spending his days among the women of his tribe, that he was definitely gender nonconforming. And now, let's consider Jacob's son, Joseph. This is the Joseph who in modern times has had a movie made about him, and he's even got his own musical. How many of you have seen Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? Okay. Well, as you may recall, Joseph's father, Isaac, gave him a wonderful robe which made all his brothers hate him. In fact, they disliked him so much that they sold him to a caravan heading down to Egypt. And there Potiphar, one of the royal guards, bought him to be a servant. And all went well until Joseph, who was really good looking, apparently, because the scripture mentions that several times, until Joseph had to start fending off the seductions of Potiphar's wife. And during one of those rejections of his boss's wife's advances, she claimed that Joseph attacked her, which got him thrown in prison. While in prison, he correctly interpreted the dreams of some of his fellow inmates, one of whom eventually recommended him to Pharaoh when that ruler was being troubled by dreams. And that was how Joseph ended up becoming one of Pharaoh's most trusted advisors. Now later on, during a time of drought in the land, Joseph's brothers, the ones who sold him into slavery, they come down to Egypt. And unbeknownst to them, because they need help, they're having drought too, they need food. Unbeknownst to them, they get sent to Joseph. Only none of those 10 brothers, get it, 10 brothers, not one of them recognize him at all. Interesting. So then there's a very dramatic story around how Joseph ends up revealing himself to his brothers and then forgiving them. You know, one teenage California girl, after learning all of this about Joseph, said with great certainty, well, isn't it obvious? Joseph was like so gay. I mean, he's got this fabulous rainbow-colored coat. Everyone comments on how cute he is, and he refuses to sleep with that Egyptian hottie. He is like totally gay. Well, that might be the case. In fact, Bible commentators as far back as medieval times were noting that there was something different about Joseph. Or could it be that Joseph was transgender? This is the interpretation of Joseph's story offered by several students of the scripture, including playwright Peterson Toscano. He was the first one to point out to me what I have since read about elsewhere, and that is a key word in this story. The word occurs in the 37th chapter of Genesis. Let's go back to our bulletins and read a little of Joseph's story, okay? You back in there, you got Joseph. All right. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man, literally youth or lad, of 17, which is interesting in itself that he should be called a youth or lad because in the Jewish tradition, a boy became a man at age 13. So that in itself is a little interesting, okay? Anyways, this lad of 17 was tending the flocks with his brothers. Now Israel, it's Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So when Joseph, skip the footnote for now, continuing on in that story, Joseph's brothers are out in the field tending their flocks. And so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it. When Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." And then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son for many days. So what we see here in this story of Joseph is that there is a great deal of focus on this ornate robe that his father gave him. Now, as you may have noticed, the Bible translators included a footnote after the word for ornate robe, and the footnote reads, "The meaning of the Hebrew for this word is uncertain," also in verses 23 and 32. Now, in the original Hebrew, the word used here is ketonit pasim. That's the word for which the Bible translators are saying, this meaning is uncertain. Now, what Peterson Toscano shared during his play, and what I knew to be true from my seminary training, is that when translators come across a word that they're uncertain about the meaning of, what they do is try to find other places in the Bible where the word is used to help them understand the meaning of that word. Now, there is only one other place in the Bible where the word ketonit pasim is used. And that's in the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 18. And there we find a story, a rather violent story, I'm sad to say, about Tamar. Tamar is a princess. In fact, she is the daughter of the esteemed King David. And there, in this violent story involving Tamar, interestingly enough, it states very clearly what a ketonit pasim is. Let's read that verse together. You see it there? Well, I'll read along. This will be a joint reading. Tamar, in 2 Samuel 13:18, together. Tamar was wearing an ornate robe, for this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore. So we actually do know what a ketonit pasim is. The only thing that's uncertain is why the Bible translators say the meaning of this word is uncertain when it describes a gift that Joseph is receiving from his father, Jacob. Apparently, the Bible translators were uncertain about why Jacob would give his son the kind of garment worn by the daughters of a king. Maybe they were not familiar with the notion, or maybe they were not comfortable with the notion that someone born in a male body might actually identify internally as a woman. But it seems that the patriarch Jacob, the gender non-conforming mama's boy who liked to cook and spend his time among the tents with the women, was aware that a boy might actually identify as a girl. So out of his love for his son Joseph, Jacob gave him an ornate robe that affirmed Joseph's internal gender identity. Jacob gave Joseph the kind of garment worn by the virgin daughters of the king. Possibly. And in his play, Peterson suggested that this is why Joseph's brothers hated him so much, and why they especially hated that ornate robe and made sure that that offensive dress was gotten rid of in the same process through which they got rid of Joseph. And let's face it, this interpretation makes sense because, after all, it's not uncommon, sadly, for a transgender person to be rejected by their family. And it's also not uncommon for a trans individual to be the victim of violence, as Joseph was. And likewise, it's not uncommon for Bible translators not to see what they don't expect to see, or for them to be unclear about what doesn't match their expectations. And that's true for all of us. Once we glance at something and see one thing, what we've already seen, what we already know, may actually hinder us from seeing what else there is to be seen. So we've just considered how the patriarch Jacob and his son Joseph were both gender nonconforming in some way. Who knows? Maybe Joseph was intersex and Jacob had known that. We don't know. But these are things we may not have seen until this morning. Now let's look at another biblical character. Let's consider the story of Deborah. If you look back at your bulletin, you'll see that Deborah's story is found in chapters 4 and 5 of the book of Judges. Follow along as I read these excerpts from her story. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands." Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." "Well, certainly I will go with you," said Deborah. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. To summarize how that story ends, Barak's troops were victorious in that venture. They soundly defeated Jabin's army. Now that commander, Jabin, fled on foot when he saw that his troops were routed, and took shelter in the tent of an Israelite woman. And while he was sleeping in her tent, that woman, in another very gender nonconforming act, drove a tent peg through his head and killed him. Now, if you're a fan of action flicks, then you gotta love those Old Testament stories, lots of action, lots of violence. Now, living as we do, during an era when Sandra Day O'Connor served on the Supreme Court, she was actually given an honorary doctorate at my graduation from college, and when Hillary Clinton is running for president and Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of England, we may read the story of Deborah and not really think twice about it. But given the ancient male-dominated time and era during which Deborah served as a judge in Israel, this is back in the very beginning days of Israel, before they even had kings, after they'd just come out of the wilderness into the promised land. They were still kind of a loose confederation of tribes, and they would a judge would arise, and people would take their disputes to them, and those men would settle them. Always men, except for Deborah. So the fact that she was doing those things during this era, this account is just nothing short of a gender nonconforming miracle story. These things that Deborah was doing, settling disputes, being a prophet, speaking on God's behalf, leading an army, this was all strictly men's work. In a day and age when women were basically nothing more than property, when contact with blood made you ritually unclean, so think about it, for several days out of every month, women were ritually unclean, and when a woman's worth and social status and value was measured pretty much solely by the number of children she bore to her husband, what was it about Deborah that allowed her to even imagine that she could be a judge in Israel? Obviously, she must have had a different sense of herself than most of the women of her day. And what was it about her that made men seek her out to settle their disputes? What qualities and characteristics did she possess that caused the military commander Barak to say, if you go with me, I will go, but if you don't, I won't go? Did Deborah possess a masculine essence, a masculine energy that enabled herself and others to see her as a judge, a prophet, a military leader? These are the questions that we are free to ask, and the possibilities that we're enabled to see when we take a closer look at Scripture, when we're open to seeing things other than what we've always seen in the past. So in that open state of mind, I'd like us now to turn our attention to another passage of Scripture, to some verses found in Deuteronomy chapter 22. There in our bulletins, we're going to start by reading just the first 8 verses of this passage from Deuteronomy. If you see your fellow Israelites' ox or sheep straying, do not ignore it, but be sure to take it back to its owner. If they do not live near you, or if you do not know who owns it, take it home with you and keep it until they come looking for it. Then give it back. Do the same if you find their donkey or cloak or anything else they have lost. Do not ignore it. Literally, do not hide yourself. If you see your fellow Israelites' donkey or ox fallen on the road, do not ignore it. Help the owner get it to its feet. A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. If you come across a bird's nest beside the road, either in a tree or on the ground, and the mother is sitting on the young or on the eggs, do not take the mother with the young. You may take the young, but be sure to let the mother go, so that it may go well with you and you may have a long life. When you build a new house, make a parapet around your roof so that you may not bring the guilt of bloodshed on your house if someone falls from the roof. And we'll stop there for now. Now, in Deuteronomy 22:5, we read, a woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. At first glance, what we see here is a prohibition against men and women wearing clothes of the opposite gender. So, if we only glance at this passage, we would most likely conclude that today, in the 21st century, God detests cross-dressers, drag queens, pre-surgery transsexuals, any of my butch lesbian friends, and me, since I only wear dresses about probably 4 or 5 times a year. But if we look a little closer, we see some other interesting things. For example, if we look at the context in which this passage is found, and in seminary, I had a New Testament professor that just drilled into us the acronym CIE. Context is everything. So following my professor's teaching, let's look closely at the context in which these passages appear. As you may have noticed, Deuteronomy 22:5 is surrounded by verses that deal with the obligations between us and our neighbors. In the verses immediately preceding this verse, we learn that we are obligated to return lost objects and help lift up our neighbor's ox if it has fallen in the road. In the verses following this text on cross-dressing, we are taught proper relations to birds on their nests, and also to build houses with guardrails on the roof to protect the safety of our guests. So given that the context of this passage is instructions about not damaging relations between beings, we have to ask ourselves, in what sorts of situations might cross-dressing negatively impact relationships with God or others? In the now out-of-print book, Transgendered, Theology, Ministry, and Communities of Faith, author Justin Tanis suggests several answers to this question. Back in Old Testament times, cross-dressing could negatively impact one's relationship with God because back then, men and women often cross-dressed in practicing their worship of foreign gods. And for the Jews, worshiping foreign gods was like a slap in the face of their God, Yahweh. Meanwhile, cross-dressing could damage relationships with others if the person was doing it to deceive. For example, Justin Tanis suggested that women might cross-dress in order to gain forbidden access to men's spaces. One such example of space forbidden to women was the military. And I get that, because I've read accounts of women during our Civil War cross-dressing, disguising themselves as men so they could serve either as spies or actually fight in the war. Now, back in Old Testament times, women might also disguise themselves in male clothes in order to gain access to the temple, to be able to sit at the feet of the rabbis, kind of like what Barbra Streisand did in the movie Yentl. This type of deceptive cross-dressing could damage human relations. Likewise, relations could be damaged if men disguised themselves to gain forbidden access to women's private spaces, a sentiment that we hear echoed in the modern day objections to trans individuals using restrooms that match their internal but not their biological identity. These were some of the ways in which cross-dressing back then could damage relations with God and others, if it was used in the worship of foreign gods or in order to deceive others. Now, another commentary that I read on this verse focused on another significant aspect of the context in which Deuteronomy 22:5 is situated. In an online sermon, Rabbi Lisa Edwards focuses on the phrase that appears 3 times in this verses: do not ignore it. Do not ignore someone's animal that is strayed. Do not ignore something that your neighbor has lost. Do not ignore your neighbor struggling to raise their fallen oxen. Rabbi Edwards points out that the literal translation of this phrase, do not ignore it, is actually do not hide yourself. And while do not ignore it is a nice interpretation, she suggests that it's not quite the same as do not hide yourself. Rabbi Edwards writes, hiding yourself is different from ignoring something or being indifferent to someone else's plight. Hiding yourself is not only about shirking responsibility, it's about closeting yourself. It's about hoping no one will see you. Maybe it's about hoping you won't notice yourself, won't notice who you really are. Perhaps this verse, when read in its fullest context, is about not hiding yourself behind clothes that do not belong to you, that do not show who you are, that do not allow you to feel like yourself when you are wearing them. End quote. Understood in this context, this verse appears, at first glance, to be a law against cross-dressing. But actually, when we look at it more closely, it becomes an exhortation to modern-day gender nonconforming individuals to dress in the clothes that truly reflect their internal gender identity. And this surprising perspective, which arises from a careful consideration of the context of this passage, is a perfect example of why my New Testament professor told us over and over and over again, context is everything. Context is everything. So for us this morning, I would challenge us to consider the question, is there anything that we're hiding from? Any part of our true selves that we are still hiding? Is it some gift that we have that we have yet to bring forth and share with the world? Is there some knowledge of ourselves that we have yet to share with our families and our close relations? Our texts for this morning seem to suggest that when it comes to bringing forth our true self, that is always God's desire. And we have the biblical characters, Jacob, Joseph, Deborah, to lead the way. Now, because context is everything, our context this morning is that it's rather warm in here. And I have several more pages of this sermon. But come back for part 3, which Carrie prophesied. And you see, we have another prophet among us. Come back for part 3, and we'll look a little bit at Genesis and what goes on there, and how God creating male and female in God's image what that might have to say to this whole experience of transgender. And so it is.